Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. Thank you all very much for your feedback on the last games. It was great to hear that people enjoyed it and that people enjoyed the live premiere as well. I was very interested with how it goes. It really felt like we were all in the capital with everyone commenting at the same times. I've decided I'm going to do it like that for the Quells from now on in the future, so I look forward to doing another premiere for part 2 of the 90th games. However, for now, I'd like to thank my Patreons, and also I'm going to be mentioning the Hunger Games Discord at the end in more detail. I've had a look at it, and it looks really interesting, even though I don't know much about Discord, but it seems like anyone who loves the Hunger Games will love that as well. I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean for the art that's produced in this episode and every episode since the Reclamation. And if you enjoy this series, you might want to check out some other links that are in the description. So, without further ado, let's go. Towards the end of the first reaping day, Madison Hawker and her entourage from the capital arrived in District 8. Madison immediately stated that the district was one of the ugliest places that she had ever seen, and apparently not wanting to spend too long there, she requested that they got on with the reaping as quickly as possible. After a brief speech, Madison menacingly looked over the purple-clad female youths of the district before plunging her hand into their bowl to reveal that she had chosen 16-year-old Marlena Mahoney. Like many others from District 8, this brittle orphan had already abandoned her studies and now spent her days and nights working in a factory that produced rugs. After a brief gasp of shock, Marlena quietly made her way to the aisle, and before commenting on anything else, Eugenia stated that Marlena's tatty violet dress looked like it was about to fall apart at the seams. Indeed, as she walked to the platform, the cameras mercifully focused on her slicked-back blonde hair glistening in the sunlight instead of her dress, that she was now gripping against her back in order to stop it from falling apart, which was even causing some laughter from the surrounding crowds. Madison nonchalantly shook hands with Marlena before strutting to the male reaping bowl, and as she thrust her hand inwards, she winked at the youngest boys, most of whom seemed extremely scared. The male tribute was then announced to be 17-year-old Chintz Sands. This young man was known for his fine tailoring skills around the hem, an upmarket area of District 8, where crime and disease were relatively uncommon. After the camera zoomed in to show Chintz's expression of sorrow, he subsequently flounced off to the aisle before marching towards the reaping platform with a rare sense of style. His long brown hair and fuchsia shawl flowed in the breeze behind him, and Eugenia stated that she had never seen the reaping aisle used as a modelling runway until now. Chintz shook hands with Madison and Marlena before the trio were escorted into the town hall. Without saying another word to the newly reaped tributes, Madison made her way to the station, before making the long journey to District 7, whilst Chintz and Marlena were each allowed to receive some visitors before they headed to the capital. Chintz was visited by his parents and younger sister, Prash. Whilst Chintz's parents were clearly upset, Prash could not stop crying at the thought of her older brother leaving, but as Chintz spoke to his parents, he calmed Prash by plaiting her hair and promising her that he would make another dress for her when he came back from the games. As his family were escorted from the room, Chintz's father reminded him to stay alert of the other tributes, but as soon as they were out of sight, Chintz began to cry before being escorted down to the station. Marlena, on the other hand, was only visited by one of her friends, Dank, a colleague from the factory. He wished Marlena all the fortune he seemed capable of mustering before drunkenly offering her a swig of his whiskey, and he was quickly dismissed by the nearest peacekeeper, whilst Marlena, who was now on the verge of tears once more, was dragged down to the station. In little to no time, the journey began, and it emerged that Chintz and Marlena were at least familiar enough with each other to know the other's name. They spoke a little about how they were feeling, but it was clear to the Avox who was present that both tributes were still in shock to some degree. After a few minutes, the food was brought in, and the pair quickly helped themselves. Yet within a few minutes of eating an array of different chocolates, a delicacy that was banned in District 8, their mentor, Ava Berrick, entered the carriage and told them to not take another piece. Marlena seemed more confused than Chintz, but Ava explained that they needed to be as healthy as possible over the next week if they wanted to have a chance of surviving. Before Ava could even say another word, Chintz excitedly stated that he recognized Ava from his first year at the reapings a few years ago, and that her wired armor in the arena had been splendid. Ava graciously accepted the compliment, but then tried to calm Chintz down, before leading him and Marlena to the seating area and stating that whilst fashion is indeed important, it would not be enough to win the games on its own. Over the next few hours, Ava spoke to the pair about the upcoming week and about how they could gain sponsors. When she mentioned that she would be their stylist, Chintz squealed excitedly before rapidly applauding and stating to Marlena that they were going to look fabulous, although Ava quickly stated that if he clapped that loudly in her face again, he would soon have a black eye and hence not look so fabulous. Once the pair had eaten some more food and the sky outside was pitch black, Ava sent them to their carriages so that they could rest. Whilst Chintz seemed more exhausted, Marlena asked if she could stay up a little longer and watch the stars in the sky outside, which she claimed were not possible to see from District 8. Ava allowed this, and as they looked out the window, she asked Marlena if Chintz was usually like this, to which Marlena stated that she did not know, but that it seemed likely, which made Ava laugh and Marlena giggle slightly. The next morning, the train arrived in Snow Station, and whilst Marlena immediately seemed intimidated and dumbstruck by the array of bright lights and bustling crowds, Chintz appeared at ease and was all too eager to pose for pictures with any capital resident who requested one, although Marlena was heard asking Ava what the cameras were. Ava quickly reassured Marlena before whisking her and Chintz away from the crowds, much to Chintz's displeasure, and towards the tribute's accommodation building. Between watching the reapings that followed over this day, Ava encouraged Marlena and Chintz to join her in doing some exercises, but when it was time for District 2's reaping games, Chintz asked Ava if they could watch these games, as it may help them to see their potential opponents fight. Ava was rather surprised that these games were being shown, but it had recently been decided that these games, along with District 1's talent displays and debates, would now be shown on Capital TV. Ava therefore agreed, and the trio watched as the volunteers from District 2 fought in the mud pit. For this year's reaping games, a record number of 27 volunteers were fighting, with many of them stating beforehand that they could have done better than the tributes that were sent into the games the year before. Within 10 minutes, only 9 volunteers remained, and Juventa Yaroon came into trouble when her friend Leticia was strangling her to the ground, but Rubius Dalton saved Juventa by sneaking up behind Leticia and ripping off her remaining collar. Juventa and Rubius then continued to roam through the mud pit together, and they dispatched their remaining opponents by working together. In fact, when Juventa was the only remaining female volunteer, she offered to stay on and help Rubius, even though the victorious volunteer of each gender is traditionally airlifted from the mud pit. The pair wasted no time in eliminating Rubius's remaining male opponents, and within half an hour, they were being bathed and groomed for their interviews with the reigning victor, Madison Hawker. When they finally arrived on the stage, Juventa's bright red curls flowed effortlessly over her golden dress, and Eugenia stated that she would kill for that garment. Juventa spoke about her love of throwing spears, and how she could not wait to enter the arena and put her practice into good use. Within a few minutes of Rubius's interview beginning, he had taken off his gloves from the reaping games to show that the nails on his left hand were several inches longer than those on his right, and that he had spent the last 3 years carving them for when he would be in the games. When the camera showed a closer shot of Rubius's nails, a mixture of admiration and horror was felt by viewers of the capital and the districts, with Juventa asking if Rubius would have cut his nails if he had not won the reaping games, but he stated that this would never happen, as victory ran in his blood, with Ennius Dalton being his uncle. Juventa and Rubius were subsequently escorted to the train for the brief journey to the capital. The pair seemed to find it hard to contain their excitement, but their mentors, Ennius Dalton and Maxima Liu, quickly entered their carriage in order to talk to them about the upcoming week. According to the Avox present, Juventa and Maxima seemed to ignore each other, and Juventa spent most of her time looking at and talking to Ennius instead. Maxima spoke about the parade and how they could make a good impression, before Ennius stated that unlike past years, they should not ally with the tributes from District 1. Juventa in particular was perplexed by this suggestion, but Maxima went on to explain that after the career pack had turned on each other during last year's games, it was best not to trust District 1 at all from now on. Ennius also stated that neither he nor Maxima had worked with District 1 during their games, and they were the only surviving victors of District 2. Maxima then spoke in detail about how much she disliked Estelle Van Roosh, and how she only won by luck. Within mere minutes of this monologue beginning, the train arrived at Snow Station, and the quartet disembarked onto the platform. Whilst Juventa successfully posed in a semi-seductive manner with a variety of capital citizens, many others were in awe at Rubius's long nails, and Eugenia Ravenstill's sister, Petunia, rather infamously lowered the back of her dress, before asking Rubeus to run his nails down her back. As Rubeus willingly performed this request, Petunia stated that this felt better than sex, and within minutes of this act being photographed, it had appeared in the vast majority of media outlets throughout the capital, and many citizens were already lining up to sponsor Rubeus. The next day, Ava performed a dress fitting for Chintz and Marlena in their apartment, and within half an hour, she and her co-stylist had already sewed a pair of perfectly fitting garments from purple and blue velvet materials. Whilst Chintz enjoyed strutting around the apartment and twirling by the window, Marlena seemed overwhelmed by the sheer size and elegance of this gown, and Ava winced as she admitted that the garment was wearing her. Ava therefore trimmed the edges of the dress, and Marlena seemed somewhat more at ease. Although Chintz begged Ava to let him use the trimmings of Marlena's dress to make a headpiece, she refused, and reminded him that they were supposed to wear matching outfits. Meanwhile, Juventa and Rubeus were dressed in golden, sparkling stonemason outfits. Whilst Maximo went to the apartment below to have a good old catch-up with Estelle, Ennius insisted that Rubeus wear a glove for this parade, as other tributes and even mentors might try to see that his nails meet with an unfortunate accident before the games began, and the parade would be the prime opportunity for this to happen. The parade took place that evening, and it began in chaos when Crystal and Wonder, both from one, accidentally dropped some diamonds onto the ground behind them, which scared the horses that were pulling Rubeus and Juventa's chariot. These horses jumped slightly, and the chariot wobbled rather dangerously, although Rubeus and Juventa both managed to hold onto the bar in front of them, and as more chariots entered behind them, they victoriously held their hands together and waved to the crowd. As Crystal looked behind at Rubeus, he even pulled off his glove and somewhat jokingly clawed his hand in her direction, which prompted her to turn back round to the front. Chintz and Marlena also performed well during the parade, and Chintz definitely seemed in his element as the crowds cheered on. Although Marlena appeared somewhat uncomfortable from all this attention, Chintz held her hand and prompted her to wave, which appeared to make her more at ease as the parade went on. Their outfits were also well received, and they made the honourable mentions in Anderson Fashion's Best Dressed. However, it was Potenzo and Scarlett, both from 5, who won the main title, when their mentor, Lynette Laurier, had asked for them to be dressed in large antennas all over their bodies, which appeared to be transferring electricity to each other as their chariot headed down the parade. Although these outfits were rather amusing, their silver textures were also bedazzling, and indeed fashionable, and seeing as Potenzo had previously volunteered for his younger brother during the reaping, he and Scarlett were already in high standing with the capital. The training followed over the next 2 days, and Juventa and Rubeus deliberately made no effort to talk to Wonder or Crystal. The pairs instead chose to share a series of rather tense stares with each other as the 2 days went by. Shortly after tributes were told to start practicing at the station of their choice, Ariel from 4 and Florence from 12 tried to make sense of how to use a bow and arrow most effectively, and Juventa wasted no time in quietly approaching the station and firing her own arrows without speaking to them, which appeared to intimidate the girls, and they quickly moved to another station. Juventa spent most of the next 2 days following these girls, Hooks from 4 and Clover from 11, although it is unknown why she went for them specifically. Furthermore, Maxima said to Juventa that the last thing District 2 needed was another outlying alliance working against them, which allegedly resulted in a large argument occurring during a training break between the two ladies. Rubeus spent most of the training time throwing spears, and it was noted by some other tributes that he let out several grunts and roars of triumph whenever he hit one of his targets, which made Stefan and Pernell, both from 9, laugh from the station behind him when he hit a target shortly before noon on the first day. When Rubeus heard their laughter, he quickly went over to confront the pair, and even had to be held back by Training Master Crane. Yet it was Rubeus who had the last laugh, as even though he was not that tall or muscular, he appeared to have scared Pernell enough to make her wet herself, and she had to be dismissed by her mentor, Atala Jasper, in order to clean herself. As Pernell left, Rubeus looked up to the mentor gallery to see that his uncle Ennius was struggling not to laugh at what had just happened, and when Atala looked away, he gave a nod of approval to Rubeus. Meanwhile, Chintz practiced in the sword station for a while with Brad from 11, but when he realized that there was no way that he would improve his fencing skills to a strong enough level in time for the games, he moved to the camouflage station and worked with Houston from 6, who showed him how to camouflage himself in exchange for Chintz showing him how to sew. The pair continued to get on rather well, but Ava later warned Chintz that whilst making an ally could be beneficial, he would maybe have to kill him if he wanted to win. As for Marlena, She spent the 2 days wandering rather aimlessly between various stations, but once again seemed rather lost, and did not spend a long amount of time in any particular station, which caused her skills to remain relatively stagnant, and as the 2 days passed, it was noticed that Ava's attention was resting more and more with Chintz instead of Marlena. The assessments of training scores followed, and Rubius was delighted to receive a score of 11, thanks to what was described as a savage nail display by Training Master Crane, whilst Juventus scored a 10 after accurately throwing a record amount of spears within the allotted time. When the training scores were revealed, the pair were allegedly delighted to have beaten Wonder and Crystal, who each scored a 9, and Maxima even congratulated Juventa, although she quickly followed by stating that she could have scored an 11 if she had chosen a more original talent. Other high scorers included Potenzo from 5 and Brad from 11, who also scored a 9. On the other end of the scale, Chintz only scored a 4 by tying together various fabrics in order to create a makeshift form of armour, whilst Marlena scored a 3, although it is unknown what she did in order to receive this score. Marlena's score was the lowest, but she was also tied with Houston from 6, Bardiche from 7, and Clover from 11. The day before the games, the interviews took place, with Eugenia opting to wear a dark dress that some described to look like living tar, rubbed all over her body. Crystal and Wonder each made strong impressions with the audience, most likely helped by their good looks and natural charm. Juventa's interview followed, and she stated that she looked forward to the games tomorrow, and to showing what she was able to do with a spear. This gained an enthusiastic cheer from the audience, although it was noted that several tributes looked rather scared after hearing this. Rubius's interview took a similar format to Juventa's, and he mentioned that he would like to kill as many different tributes in as many ways as possible. This also caused applause from the audience, and Florence from 12 was shown to let out a whimper of despair for the platform behind. Eugenia also asked if Rubius could scratch her back with his nails, to which he willingly agreed. These nails had in fact become rather controversial, as it was thought that they could bring an unfair advantage to Rubius, but seeing as they were part of his body and not an artificial weapon, no further action was taken. When it was time for Chintz's interview, he wore a purple tunic and turban, and wasted no time in stating that he had designed this outfit himself. As the audience laughed and applauded, Eugenia grinned and stated that it was certainly original. She also stated that she would love for Chintz to create some more outfits for her, to which he replied that if he survived the games, he would happily do so, which gained cheers from the audience, and by the time he was dismissed, he seemed to be one of the capital favourites this year. Marlena's interview did not start strongly, and she was clearly intimidated by the bright lights and crowds, which led to Eugenia asking and practically answering the questions for Marlena, who sat nodding and shaking her head. However, as the interview went on, Marlena managed to speak a little more, and even joked about how the training staff looked. After comparing Training Master Crane to a crazy grizzly bear, Eugenia reassuringly said to the laughing audience that this one might have a few surprises up her sleeve. The final interview was that of game maker Artulia Fling, who was met with cascades of cheers that lasted for well over a minute, and eventually had to be simmered down by Eugenia. Artulia stated that she had had a brilliant year, experimenting with new mutts and testing various hazards within Ravenstill Prison. This mustered a clear sound of interest from the audience, and Artulia stated that she could not wait to show the capital what she had planned. The next day, tributes were led to their holding rooms, where they were instructed to change into thin lycra suits of their district colours that were already hanging up by their tubes. As Juventa marvelled at the golden fabric that now covered her body, Maxima visited and admitted that she may have been a little harsh during the past week, but that Juventa could win if she showed some fire. Meanwhile, Ennius gave Rubius some final encouragement and stated to him that he was born to win. As for the tributes from District 8, Ava reminded Chintz to focus, and that looking good was important, but that nobody would look good when they died. She subsequently visited Marlena and told her that she should try to run when the gong sounded and not look back. The countdown began, and the tributes entered their tubes, which rose into the arena. This year's games took place in a volcanic forest. As many tributes guessed from their arena clothing, this year's arena was rather warm, thanks to the heat that emanated from a large mountainous volcano in the centre of the arena. Many silver rocks and dry, scanty trees were scattered throughout, with occasional hills rising and falling towards the perimeter. A small cornucopia area made of dried mud lay at the ground before the volcano's hill, with plenty of wide open space in the area beyond, before the nearest trees could provide shelter. Like any other year, a large variety of weapons could be found within the cornucopia, but unlike most years, the supplies were not particularly visible to the tributes, and they were instead hidden inside backpacks that were scattered between the podiums and the cornucopia itself. Gamemaker Fling had deviously ordered that some of these backpacks contained food and drink, others contained rope and wires, whilst a few simply contained rocks that could be found throughout the arena. Furthermore, each of these backpacks contained a small compartment at the bottom that was not visible to tributes unless they looked particularly closely. When the podiums rose into the arena, Chintz from 8 carefully looked around the cornucopia, and he quickly darted his eyes around to see that he was stood on the far right of the podiums, between Crystal from 1 and Brad from 11. He then looked across to see that Marlena from 8 was stood on the extreme left of the podiums, next to Potenzo from 5, and he tried to nod to her reassuringly, but she seemed somewhat transfixed by the backpacks in front of her. Furthermore, when Chintz looked back to see Crystal rather menacingly grinning at him, he suddenly appeared almost repulsed and seemed ready to run. As for Rubius and Juventa, both from 2, they were stood in central podiums either side of Clover from 11, and they seemed to be signalling to each other that they would run forward to grab weapons. When the countdown reached 10 seconds, Rubius looked to his other side to see that Panel from 9 had turned a deadly shade of pale, and he laughed at her scared expression. Just seconds later, the gong sounded. Almost all the tributes charged inwards, although Chintz surprised many capital citizens by running away, along with Clover from 11 and Florence from 12. As he sprinted towards the nearest trees that lay a few hundred meters away, he seemed aghast when he looked back to see the carnage that was ensuing. Meanwhile, Rubius ran straight towards a set of throwing knives that lay in the mouth of the cornucopia. As he ran, he lashed his left hand out at the face of the boy from 12, who shouted as he fell to the ground and clutched his nose. Rubius continued, and surprisingly, the girl from 10 had reached the mouth of the cornucopia before him, but just as she picked up the throwing knives that Rubius had been aiming for, he slashed his hand upwards against her face, and as she screamed and fell backwards, Rubius caught the set of throwing knives that had been tied together by a rather strong string. Rubius then threw the knives as quickly as he could at a variety of tributes, and only the boy from 3 managed to grab a weapon without being hit by Rubius, who proceeded to run away from the weapons when more tributes began to charge towards the cornucopia. As the girl from 6 ran in for a spear, Juventa quickly grabbed a sword and practically beheaded her, before charging to her right. She then looked ahead to see Marlena looking into one of the backpacks, annoyed that it only contained a large rock. Marlena got up, but just as she was running to another nearby backpack, Juventa tackled her and proceeded to stab her continuously through the chest. Marlena screamed and quickly lost consciousness, but whilst Juventa looked around for other targets, a knife flew into her upper back, and she screamed extremely loudly as she fell forwards onto Marlena's body. It was seen by viewers that this knife was thrown by Wonder, and when this was noticed during the live opening to the games, gasps echoed through Snow Square, with many citizens apparently surprised that the careers appeared to be turning on each other this quickly. Yet whilst Juventa shouted out in pain, she turned around to see Wonder about to throw another knife towards her from just a few meters away. Juventa winced as she tried to get ready to dodge Wonder's aim, but just as he was about to throw the knife, Rubius ran up behind him and slashed his nails across the back of Wonder's head. Wonder shouted as blood flew from the back of his head, but just as he appeared ready to throw another knife at Rubius, the girl from 3 suddenly fell backwards between the two boys, and Scarlet from 5 sprinted towards her, with the sword at the ready. In yet another surprise move, Wonder scarpered to his feet and ran back towards Crystal, who was stabbing the boy from 10 through the heart, whilst Rubius ran forward and helped Juventa up from the ground. Despite clearly being in pain, Juventa managed to grab a nearby backpack that contained food, and Rubius supported her as they fled from the cornucopia, with the knife still in Juventa's back. Within 10 minutes, all the surviving tributes had fled from the cornucopia, and as the hovercraft collected the bodies of the fallen, Eugenia and Crane commented that this was one of the strangest bloodbaths that they had ever seen, with many of the useful backpacks having not been taken. Crane also stated that the backpacks containing rocks could have also been used as weapons. They checked back on the tributes and the various directions in which they had headed. Chintz had continued to run straight from the center of the arena, and he was the first tribute to reach the surrounding tree line. He spent most of the next hour running, then jogging, then walking to the perimeter. In fact, he almost walked straight into the force field, but luckily for him, he noticed it at the final moment and moved away to a sensible distance. As he sat down on the rocks, 7 cannons sounded. Meanwhile, Rubeus and Juventa rested as soon as they reached the nearest area of trees. Juventa complained about her wound, and Rubeus said that he would take out the knife on the count of 3. Yet after only counting to 1, he pulled out the knife and Juventa had to try hard to not scream. Luckily for her, the knife had not hit her spine, and despite a slight limp, she was able to continue walking with relative ease. When the 7 cannons sounded, she and Rubeus started to walk slightly faster, and over the next few minutes, they discussed where they should aim to travel within the area. But just as Juventa suggested that they head to the perimeter and head all the way round, Rubeus hushed her, and several screams were heard through the forest. These screams belonged to tributes who were discovering that the hidden sections at the bottom of their backpacks each contained 2 scorpions, who had been specifically designed to feed off blood, with most tributes initially being given a fright by these creatures as they scurried over their backs, before realizing to their relief that they could easily be killed by smashing a rock against them, which led to the vast majority of tributes surviving this episode unharmed. However, the scorpions inside Juventa's backpack ripped through the fabric of the bottom section slightly slower than the other scorpions, and it was not until most of the screaming had ended that Juventa noticed a scorpion climbing up her back. She desperately tried to reach it, but this caused her more pain, and before Rubeus had finished stomping on the other scorpion with his foot, the scorpion on Juventa's back had reached her injury, and she shrieked as she fell to the ground. Rubeus proceeded to run towards Juventa, and he lashed so quickly at the scorpion with his nails that it went flying through the air and hit a tree. Through gasps of pain, Juventa stated that her injury felt even worse, but Rubeus responded that they should carry on. They continued walking up a hill, but within a minute, they were alerted to more screaming that was coming to their left. The pair ran towards the sound, and they found Clover, from 11, lying painfully on the ground and clutching her leg. It was seen to viewers that she had finally managed to crush the scorpion from her backpack with a rock, although it had given her a nasty wound on her leg beforehand. Although her screaming had almost ceased when Juventa and Rubeus came into view, she desperately tried to get up as the pair approached. Juventa stopped Rubeus and told him to let her have this one, before readying her sword and charging it through Clover's heart. Although Clover's cannon sounded just seconds later, Juventa continued to stab her relentlessly in a frenzied rage, and as this was shown, Eugenia infamously stated, "I don't think she's very happy." However, Rubeus came over and had to practically drag Juventa away so that the hovercraft could collect Clover's body. As he led her away and they continued walking up the hill, he asked Juventa if she was feeling better, to which she replied that she was feeling slightly better. Meanwhile, Chintz had been hearing the screaming throughout the forest, but as he was not in possession of a backpack, he was blissfully unaware of what was causing these sounds. He spent the next few hours trying to chop and fashion the tree branches into a kind of clothing or camouflage, although it was rather unclear as to what exactly he was going for. Either way, the citizens in Snow Square seemed to find Chintz's posing with the branches rather amusing, and sponsors gifted him with a bottle of water, for which he gave thanks to whomever had done this. As the darkness of night set in, he practiced throwing the rocks against a nearby tree, presumably to improve his aim. Although he was not particularly gifted in this skill, his aim did improve, and by the time it had become dark, he was practically able to hit the tree with a rock from several meters away. On the other side of the arena, Juventa and Rubeus were resting in a small alcove at the top of a hill. They had decided to spend the night taking turns to keep watch and sleep, before hunting for other tributes the next day. Yet as the moonlight rather clearly illuminated their area, viewers and Rubeus were able to see that Juventa's wound had become infected by the scorpion's bite, and was now a pale shade of green. Furthermore, she was complaining about her back being painful, and Crane stated that although Rubeus was trying to put on a strong front, he seemed worried. Yet just as Juventa stated that maybe they should continue to rest the next day, a cannon sounded. This cannon was revealed to belong to the boy from 7, after he had been chased and killed by Crystal and Wonder. Rubeus and Juventa watched as the hovercraft entered through the top of the arena and came towards them, but they were shocked to see it retrieving a body from less than 200 meters away. As the hovercraft flew away, they heard the cackles of Crystal rolling through the woods around them, and with a pensive, then bittersweet expression, Rubeus stabbed his knife into the side of Juventa's neck. Juventa screamed in a mixture of pain and surprise as Rubeus thrust her to the floor, and she desperately tried to push him away, but her efforts were futile, and within a minute, she stopped moving and her cannon sounded. Rubeus then grabbed the backpack and ran behind a nearby tree, whilst the hovercraft came back into the arena and headed towards Juventa's body. Crystal and Wanda quickly discussed with each other why the hovercraft had re-entered the arena so quickly, before realizing that someone else had died very close to their position. As Juventa's body was collected, they ran towards the alcove where Rubeus had killed her shortly beforehand, but whilst they looked for any sign of another tribute, they apparently failed to realize that Rubeus was watching them. Whilst Wanda and Crystal decided to set their base for the night in this alcove, Rubeus continued to keep watch from behind the tree. Meanwhile, Chintz covered himself in tree branches, and he managed to fall asleep within a burrow of trees at the bottom of a valley close to the perimeter. The first day ended shortly after, and the portraits of Juventa from 2, both tributes from 3, the girl from 6, the boy from 7, Marlena from 8, both tributes from 10, Clover from 11, and the boy from 12 were all shown in the sky, which left 14 tributes remaining. The next morning, viewers laughed as many of the tributes were awoken by pot-bellied goats that had been introduced to the arena as the sun rose. Chintz received a rather rude awakening when a nanny goat licked his face, and he immediately pushed the goat away. She then bleated at Chintz rather loudly, and he appeared to be experiencing what Eugenia called the day 2 effect, when he looked around and quickly came to the realization of where he was. The goat waddled back and was about to ram into Chintz, but this time she seemed rather annoyed, and before she could ram against him, he kicked her away, and she tumbled down against some rocks. Chintz quickly swigged some water and he got up, ready to start travelling through the arena, possibly in search of food. Yet as he started walking, he heard the goat bleating helplessly as she lay on the rocks. Chintz turned around, and after seeing the goat looking longingly into his eyes, he swore, before breathing out in annoyance and going back to help her up. She continued to bleat, but soon began to lick Chintz's face, and he said that he would call her Artulia after game maker Fling. During her daily interview, Fling stated that she was not thrilled with this name, but that all actions have consequences. Chintz began to walk around the edge of the perimeter with Artulia, the goat, following him. Occasionally she would bleat, but Chintz stroked her neck and this seemed to quieten her. Yet unbeknownst to him, he was on the opposite side of the arena to many of the other tributes. Due to the warm temperatures, he soon became quite exhausted, and therefore chose to sit on top of a rocky hill, where he soon realized that he had a good view of the arena. He spent the rest of the morning trying to extract some milk from Artulia's udders, which eventually worked, and he collected it in the bottle, before drinking some. However, by this point, Chintz had not eaten yet, and he quietly asked if someone could send him some food. Shouts of "Eat the goat!" immediately rang through Snow Square, and after somehow appearing to be able to hear what viewers were saying, Chintz gestured towards Artulia, and stated that he could not eat her now that he had named her. Yet luckily for him, he was sent some bread shortly after, and although Artulia managed to gobble some of it when Chintz's back was turned, he appeared to be adequately replenished. Meanwhile, on the other side of the arena, Rubeus had been awoken by Crystal that morning, when she screamed after one of the goats urinated on her leg. She got angry at Wanda for letting the goat this near, to which he replied that the goat seemed harmless. She then showed her dirtied leg to Wanda, and asked if he thought this was funny, which made Wanda, Eugenia, and most viewers in Snow Square burst out in laughter. A brief squabble ensued, and Rubeus followed Crystal and Wanda as they walked towards the centre of the arena. A few goats would occasionally come towards the pair, but fortunately for all tributes, most of these goats were not dangerous, and therefore no tributes were seriously injured by them, with several tributes such as Brad from 11 and Florence from 12 capturing one and cooking it for meat. Yet shortly after noon, when the sun was blazing in the sky, Crystal and Wanda decided to take a break on the top of a rocky hill, and so Rubeus watched from a tree behind them. During this time, the pair spoke to each other about their strategy and hardly moved, whilst Rubeus grabbed his throwing knives and seemed to be readying them to throw at Crystal or Wanda. After a few tense moments, Rubeus threw his first knife. This knife was aimed straight at the back of Crystal's head, but just as it was about to hit her, she suddenly jumped up and ran forwards, quickly followed by Wanda. Neither of these tributes appeared to notice that the knife had hit a tree next to them, as they were too focused on what they could see down the hill, where Stephen and Pennell, both from 9, had just ran out of a burrow of trees at the bottom of the hill. It later emerged that the pair had run from a rather aggressive trip of goats that had chased them through the forest, and being from District 9, they had never seen these animals before. As Crystal and Wanda ran towards them, they They quickly turned backwards and ran through the trees. However, they were quickly caught, and within a minute their cannons had sounded, and they were being lifted from the arena by the hovercraft. Yet during this time, Rubeus seized his opportunity to sabotage his fellow career tributes, and as the cannons boomed out, he grabbed their supplies and ran back the way they had come. Rubeus then travelled far enough from the pair to hear them arguing about what had happened to their supplies. When Crystal slapped Wonder later that evening, Eugenia even became rather excited and said that one of them would turn on each other soon, to which Crane replied that he thought this pair would have acted more professionally within the arena. Chint spent most of the rest of this day in his vantage point with Artulia the goat. He also managed to create a kind of garment from the branches of the trees, which he used to keep himself warm as it got dark. Artulia also seemed to become rather cold, and Chintz eventually gave in to her pestering and wrapped his arm around her as she slept. Shortly before midnight, he too fell asleep. When midnight came, Rubeus lay within a burrow of trees close to the Cornucopia, and the portraits of Stefan and Penel from 9 were shown in the sky, which meant that there were now only 12 tributes remaining. As the sun rose the next morning, Rubeus quietly swore when he opened his eyes to see Wonder and Crystal walking in his direction, although luckily for him, they were too busy bickering about what time it was to notice him lying behind a tree that lay in the distance in front of them. Rubeus slowly rotated around the tree as they passed, and he was not noticed. During this time, Chintz awoke and took some milk from the udders of Artulia the goat, yet he stated that the area of the arena where he was now resting was beginning to become rather cold, and when Artulia, who also seemed to be sensing the cold, began to trot towards the Cornucopia, Chintz followed her, and they spent the next hour walking inwards, where it was indeed warmer. Rubeus also travelled back to the centre of the arena, whilst following Crystal and Wonder. After an hour had passed, he spotted Wonder pointing excitedly to a tree and shouting to Crystal, before shooting an arrow at Bardiche from 7, who had been trying to hide within the branches. She fell to the floor and begged for mercy, but just as Wonder was about to kill her properly, an announcement was made by Game Maker Fling. This was in fact the shortest announcement in the history of the Hunger Games, with her simply stating that some like it hot. Most tributes looked around quizzically, not understanding what this was supposed to signify, but Chintz was one of the few who began to sprint back towards the perimeter, quickly followed by Artulia. The ground started shaking, and Chintz and Artulia lost their balance and fell to the ground as a large noise was emitted from the volcano in the centre of the arena, before it spewed molten lava high into the air. The ground stopped shaking as the lava hurtled down the sides of the volcano, and the crowds in Snow Square cheered at the knowledge that they were about to see a good show. Chintz grabbed Artulia, and although she was bleating and shaking her hooves in a panic, Chintz somehow managed to continue running whilst holding her. As he sprinted up the nearest hill, a cannon sounded, which was shown to belong to Houston from 6, who had previously camouflaged himself into the side of the volcano and had now just been pulverized by the lava. Yet as Chintz ran, it was seen from an aerial view of the arena that an altitudinal calibration error within his sector of the arena had caused the lava to flow quicker within this sector, and as it quickly flowed towards him, he occasionally looked back and seemed to panic as he continued to flee. Meanwhile, when the ground started shaking, Wonder and Crystal abandoned Bardiche, who was losing consciousness on the ground. They grabbed most of their supplies and ran as quickly as they could, but due to his height, Wonder managed to run faster than Crystal, and he quickly passed the tree that was hiding Rubeus. However, Crystal seemed to find it rather difficult to run across the shaking ground, and she quickly collapsed and hurt her leg on a rock, just meters from where Rubeus stood. Although Crystal shouted, Wonder continued running and did not look back. The shaking of the ground began to stop, and Crystal managed to stand up again, but as she started running, she jumped at the sight of Rubeus coming out from behind the tree, and before she could even attempt to defend herself, he slashed his nails across her face, and she screamed as she fell to the floor. Wonder looked back from further up this hill when he heard Crystal, and he grinned at what he saw. Crystal held her face in pain and tried to get up to defend herself from Rubeus, who was now towering over her, but as he looked ahead to see and hear trees in the distance burning from the approaching lava, he simply slashed Crystal's face once more before turning and running. On the other side of the arena, Chintz was also fleeing from the lava, which was travelling even faster in his direction. Yet after almost a minute of running, Chintz seemed to have trouble breathing, and even seeing, due to the dark clouds of smoke that were emanating from the approaching lava within this sector, and he dropped Artulia to the ground. When he heard the cannons of Bardiche and Crystal sound, he was almost hit by a falling tree, but as he got back up and looked around in a panic, he heard Artulia bleating from in front of him, and so he followed after her, whilst coughing intensely from the thick smoke. Chintz continued chasing after Artulia's bleating through the opaque smoke and maze of trees, which somehow led him safely through the trees without any collisions. But when he saw Potenzo and Scarlet, both from 5, running in a parallel direction to his left, he veered to his right, and Artulia soon noticed his change in direction before chasing after him. Chintz soon realized that there was less smoke and the lava was approaching much slower in this sector, and so he continued running, but at a slower pace. After just over a minute, 2 more cannons sounded, which were shown to belong to Hooks and Ariel, both from 4, who had both been caught by the lava flow. Chintz and Artulia collapsed in exhaustion at the raised edge of the arena. Chintz ate some bread, and as Artulia watched him eating, he gave some to her as well, and they looked over the rest of the arena, that was now practically a large pond of lava with the volcano in the middle. Rubeus had also managed to escape from the lava flow, and was now resting on the other side of the arena within a burrow of trees. As the sun began to set, he roamed along the edge of the perimeter, and he was surprised to notice Brad from 11 and Florence from 12, resting within some trees not too far from his location. Brad had rather badly burned his arm after falling next to a puddle of lava, and Florence was using her medical expertise in order to tend to his wound. Crane pointed out to Eugenia that Rubeus was flexing his left hand as he watched them from behind a tree, but he ultimately chose to not attack them, and returned to his original burrow of trees, most likely due to both these tributes having weapons nearby. That night the fallen were shown, and it was revealed to tributes that Crystal from 1, Ariel and Hooks from 4, Houston from 6, and Bardiche from 7 had all died that day. This meant that only Wanda from 1, Rubeus from 2, Potenzo and Scarlet from 5, Chintz from 8, Brad from 11, and Florence from 12 were remaining. The next morning, the surviving tributes awoke in the hours after sunrise. Many of them spent the morning fanning themselves from the heat that was emitted from the great mass of lava that lay between the perimeter and the central volcano. Yet some of them seemed to notice that there were several rocky paths that had emerged from where the lava had been drained, which were wide enough to allow safe travel between the outer and central areas of the arena. However, just as Eugenia began to speak about her plans to take her husband and children to this arena for their winter holiday that year, Game Maker Fling made an announcement to the surviving campers that they had done well to reach this far in the games, and that in order to reward them for this achievement, a feast would be held in 1 hour within a forest that lay on a side of the volcano, and that she planned to be extremely generous. Within a minute, Wanda and Rubeus each began to head towards the central volcano, across the paths between the lava that was still draining from the arena. Chintz remained in his location, whilst Brad stated to Florence that they needed to attend, but she begged him not to, as it would be too dangerous, and he eventually conceded, whilst Potenzo and Scarlet made their way across another path towards the centre of the arena. Within the hour, Rubeus and Wanda were hiding behind trees on opposing sides of the feast clearing, with a direct view to the clearing's centre, where the feast table would rise, although it appeared that they did not spot each other during this time. Rubeus seemed to become more agitated as he stared at the centre of the clearing, with his knives and nails at the ready, until the feast table finally rose. Both Rubeus and Wanda were giving one last look around the edge of the clearing, and Rubeus finally seemed to spot Wanda on the opposite side. He readied one of the throwing knives and looked ready to throw it across the clearing. But just at that moment, Potenzo and Scarlet both sprinted together towards the table from a different side of the clearing, and Rubeus immediately held back, in an apparent state of surprise, just as Potenzo grabbed the bags for Districts 1 and 5, and Scarlet grabbed the bags for Districts 2 and 8. They immediately charged away from the table, and Potenzo shouted at Scarlet to hurry, but before he had even finished his sentence, Wanda shot an arrow at Potenzo's neck, and he collapsed to the floor with a painful shout. Scarlet looked back in a panic, but continued to run, just as Wanda emerged from the trees and readied his sword to stab Potenzo. Seeing Scarlet escaping through the tree line, Rubeus sprinted across the clearing, straight past Wanda, who was now stabbing Potenzo. Although Rubeus looked back as he ran past them, he made no effort to attack Wanda, which Crane stated was quite a surprise when they watched the replay. As Potenzo's cannon sounded, Wanda looked towards the trees that Rubius had run through, but he simply grabbed his bag and the other for District 5 before running in the opposite direction, through the trees and back down the side of the volcano. Meanwhile, Rubius chased after the sound of Scarlet's heavy breathing as she sprinted away through the trees, and within a minute he found her, before catching her and slashing her across the back. As she fell to the ground, she screamed and kicked Rubius in the groin. He groaned in pain and collapsed, and Scarlet got back up, but he grabbed her by the leg and she collapsed once more. Rubius then held her by the neck with his right hand, before thrusting the nails of his left hand through her throat. As Rubius pulled out his hand and flicked the blood from his nails, Scarlet started coughing blood, and she tried to fight back against Rubius, but within less than a minute, she lost consciousness, and as Rubius walked away with the bags for Districts 2 and 8, her cannon sounded. For the rest of the day, Chintz remained in his location and hardly moved, only eating some more of the bread and drinking some milk from Artulia. When the darkness of night set in, he spoke to Artulia about how much he missed his family, and he seemed to become quite forlorn as he did so. Although Artulia obviously could not understand him, she watched him intently as he spoke, and when the tears fell down his cheek, she licked them away. Rubius made his way back through the arena, and reached the perimeter as the sun was setting. It was at this point that he opened the bags for Districts 2 and 8, and was elated that his own bag contained armour, although when he opened the bag for District 8 to find that it only contained a comb, he laughed and threw it as hard as he could in the direction of the lava, before stating that someone must hate that guy. That night, the portraits of Potenzo and Scarlet from 5 were both shown in the sky, leaving only 5 tributes alive. Stating that tomorrow would most likely be the showdown of these games, Eugenia asked Crane who he thought would win, and he stated that whilst it seemed obvious that it would be one of the career boys, it could just as easily be Chintz. Crane even quipped that he would not mess with that goat. Eugenia stated that she had done this job long enough to know when a female is going to turn, and that her money was on Florence to win. Having barely slept that night, Wanda was the first tribute to awaken the next morning, and he walked around the edge of the arena, most likely in search of other tributes. He narrowly avoided passing Florence and Brad shortly after beginning this hunt around the perimeter, as Brad saw him coming and quickly warned Florence, who hid with him below a set of broken branches, whilst Wanda carried on past. Yet as the sun rose through the sky, Wanda was unknowingly about to pass Chintz, who was sleeping within an alcove of trees, with Artulia in his arms. Wanda would probably have walked straight past them, but Artulia began to hear his footsteps, and as he came nearer, she suddenly started bleating defensively, which awoke Chintz. He immediately grabbed a rock as Artulia ran out from the alcove into the view of Wanda. There were other goats that Wanda had encountered during his time in the arena, most of whom he had ignored, but this was the first time that one had approached him like this, and he quickly readied his bow and arrow, before pointing it at Artulia, who was now running across the rocks towards him. Chintz ran out of the clearing with the rock still in his hand, in order to see why Artulia was bleating, but just as he spotted her, Wanda shot an arrow through her chest. As Wanda quickly readied another arrow, Chintz viciously screamed at Wanda before throwing a rock at his head, which knocked him to the ground and his head started bleeding profusely. Wanda desperately tried to ready another arrow, but Chintz grabbed another rock before repeatedly smashing it down onto Wanda's head. Chintz's purple lycra suit was continually splattered by Wanda's blood, and his cannon eventually sounded. Whilst the hovercraft was entering the arena in order to collect Wanda's body, Chintz ran back over to Artulia, who was quietly bleating and struggling to move her hooves. Chintz rubbed her neck as the bleating became even quieter, and after a few minutes the noise stopped. Chintz shouted out in anger, apparently forgetting that he was in the arena, but in order to stop this offensive tirade, Game Maker Fling wisely decided to make an announcement. She merrily congratulated the remaining tributes on reaching the final 4, before mentioning that more lava was about to be pumped in through the floor of the arena, and that within approximately 10 minutes, all the unsubmerged ground in the arena, along with the raised edge at the perimeter, would be covered in lava, before wishing that the odds be in the tribute's favour, and ending her announcement as suddenly as it had started. Rubius, who had been about to travel around the perimeter, grabbed his knives and ran straight across the nearest rocky path towards the centre. As he ran, he appeared to be fanning himself with his nails due to the high temperatures that were now soaring even further. Chintz quickly dragged the body of Artulia the goat to the very edge of the perimeter, where the ground was highest, before grabbing another rock and sprinting towards the nearest path that could lead to the centre of the arena. However, just as he started to run between the pools of lava, he jumped in fright and almost slipped when a cannon sounded, which was shown to belong to Brad, who had been stabbed by Florence through the head before she left and ran towards her nearest path. Rubeus, Chintz, and Florence sprinted across different paths at various speeds, but their bodysuits, made respectively of scarlet, purple, and teal colours, all glistened and even started to tear from the proximity to the lava that was bubbling away at each of their sides as they ran. Rubeus was the first to make it to the central area, and he wasted no time in charging up the side of the volcano to higher ground. Chintz and Florence were taking slightly longer to reach the centre, with the former slipping at one point and landing so close to the lava below that part of his long hair fell into the liquid and was burned off, but he quickly got up and continued to run. However, Florence was apparently having more trouble, and as the lava's height and temperature increased either side of her, she appeared to have trouble focusing on where she was going, until she passed out and fell to the ground, within 100 meters at the side of the volcano, whilst the lava continued to rise around her. The moment that Florence fell, Chintz finally made it to the side of the volcano, and he also ran upwards as rapidly as his legs could carry him, whilst Rubeus continued to climb further to the top of the volcano. But after approximately 30 seconds, another cannon sounded. It was shown to viewers that the lava had finally inundated the rocky paths, and Florence's unconscious body was submerged. Eugenia jokingly said to Crane, "Talk about the girl on fire." Over the next minute, Chintz practically crawled up the side of the volcano, whilst Rubeus, who was now standing at a higher altitude to Chintz, looked left and spotted him. Rubeus spent the next few minutes carefully approaching Chintz, who occasionally looked up as he continued crawling, which prompted Rubeus to jump back down to the ground each time lest he be seen. Yet without being seen, Rubeus subsequently managed to dive behind a collection of large rocks that were just up the hill from Chintz, who was still climbing upwards and seemingly unaware that Rubeus was getting ready to push these rocks down towards him. The crowds in Snow Square were shouting at both the boys, with supporters of Rubeus demanding that he threw one of the rocks or even a knife, whilst those of Chintz shouted at him to look ahead. Rubeus proceeded to push against one of the rocks, and several of them began to tumble down the side of the volcano towards Chintz, who suddenly looked up as they fell towards him. He quickly rolled out the way, and although his knee was hit by one of these falling rocks, he was not too badly hit, and he quickly readied the rock that he had taken earlier. Rubeus then threw his last 3 knives at Chintz, who jumped out the way and rolled across the side of the volcano once again. But the 3rd knife hit him in the shoulder, and he shouted out in pain and called Rubeus a name that later had to be censored. Rubeus proceeded to jump out from behind the rocks, and he charged down the side of the hill towards Chintz, who was now desperately trying to take the knife out of his shoulder. Whilst letting out a primal roar, Chintz managed to pull the knife out, and he appeared to be getting ready to throw it at Rubeus. But just as Chintz was aiming the knife, Rubeus tackled him, and they both rolled down the side of the volcano for approximately 20 seconds until they collided with a borough of trees upon this hill. Both boys seemed to collide rather painfully with these trees, and Rubeus, whose face had hit a tree, was now bleeding from his nose and ear, whilst Chintz had hit his elbow against another tree and was now almost whimpering in pain. He quickly looked around for his knife as Rubeus stumbled towards him, holding his nose and vengefully looking at Chintz through his bloodshot eyes. Chintz quickly got up and ripped off a branch from the tree, but Rubeus tackled him once again, before slashing his nail across Chintz's throat. Rubeus let out a breath of exhaustion as blood splattered up against him, before slashing against Chintz's throat again and again, until his movement stopped and a final cannon sounded. Rubeus lay back against the nearest tree, and Gamemaker Fling announced that Rubeus Dalton from District 2 was the victor at the 86th Hunger Games, before congratulating him as the hovercraft entered the arena. It lifted Rubeus to safety, and he allegedly passed out within seconds of entering the hovercraft. For his interview, Rubeus and his mentor, Ennius Dalton, were dressed in sparkling white and gold suits, which helped distract from Rubeus's facial injuries, which were still visible to some degree. Eugenia congratulated him on his consistent performance throughout the games, and she joked that Ennius had taught him well, which mustered cheers and applause from the audience. During the after-party, Maxima Liu became rather inebriated and said to Rubeus that she could not stop laughing after seeing the look in Estelle Van Rouche's eye when Rubeus had killed Wanda, although Estelle was in fact standing behind Maxima when this was said, and a fight ensued between the two victors, with the nearby Avox being injured in the process. Rubeus became the mentor for District 2's male tributes for the next 2 years, until the year 100, where he led a battalion of fighters in the Battle of District 14. After the district was heroically captured by the brave warriors Panem, Rubeus met his wife, Bonnie, during the rebuilding of the district's capital city, Glasgow. The night before his wedding, he finally cut his nails, and the couple went on to have a daughter, Galus. Are you tired of the Hunger Games simulations on the internet? While they can be fun, they are completely random and offer no real consequences to your actions. There is a solution to this. The Interactive Hunger Games Discord is an immersive, complex and welcoming community available on the Discord platform as a partnered server. Once a month, you will be given the opportunity to participate in a text-based D&D style Hunger Games. You are the tribute and you must adapt to survive, fight against your opponents in rolling-based combat, or hide out with friends and allies inside the massive custom-designed arena. Gather items and use them to fight later. Forage in the darkness of the night for useful supplies. Battle against Game Maker design mutts. You can do anything you'd like within the bounds of the arena, and your actions will be reported in well-written, text-based formats at the end of each day. Your actions will have consequences, and you will control whether you live or become a victor. Don't want to be a tribute? No worries. The community also offers round-the-clock capital TV reports straight from the arena. Sponsor supplies to your favourite tributes and bet on who wins. Live a life of luxury in the capital or hardship in the districts. Participate in our server lore building, roleplay, training academies, community events, and general discussion. No other community on the internet offers the same level of immersion and activity that this one does. This is not a classic Hunger Games roleplay server where everything is randomized. This is a state-of-the-art Hunger Games community that will provide you everything you need, and more from Suzanne Collins' amazing series. Join today and immerse yourself inside a new Hunger Games experience. Over the course of 7 months, the community has seen 5 exciting games. Be there by December the 27th in order to sign up for number 6. Just before I go, I hope everyone has a great next week. Whatever you are doing, I hope you have a great time. Due to the next week being quite heavy, I might not be able to get a games done for next Monday. I might push it back to January the 4th, as I'm sure you can all understand. The next week is usually quite event and family and chaos heavy, so I might not be able to get a good enough one done in time. If not, it will be back to January the 4th. But either way, I hope everyone has a great Christmas and New Year. Take care and see you soon.